Hello, everyone. Welcome to Counter Apologist. I'm doing an interview with someone I am extremely excited to talk to, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. He is a Christian philosopher and apologist of sorts. Really, one of my favorite Christians to talk to online. We go back and forth on Twitter a lot. Josh, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. I love our Twitter conversations as well. You're one of my favorites as well. And yeah, I'm just glad we could be here. In fact, it was through Twitter that you invited me on, and I thought this will be good. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things that most interested me about wanting to talk to you in general is you're very, very open, I think, to exploring new ideas and are
Yeah.
extraordinarily charitable to your interlocutors. And what struck me is you're one of the Christian philosophers who's so public in I guess, the online, the popular sphere that I operate
Hmm.
in, who's a universalist, and you're not afraid to defend it.
No.
No fear.
I'm
Um,
not afraid to explore the territories of reality that other people say, hey, that's behind the fence. You're not allowed to go over there. And I'm like, why not? Let's open up that fence. Let's see what's over there.
and
Yeah, for sure.
it's definitely appreciated. And so you've been on quite a few channels with talking to people who I very much respect. Majesty of Reason, Capturing
Mhm.
Christianity. You get around, and you decide to slum it with me, so I greatly appreciate it.
This is like my favorite kind of thing to do. And I just want to say, John, I appreciate that you say I'm an apologist of sorts because I feel like I'm kind of an explorer in a sense, so that even as I begin to arrive at a view, it becomes a working hypothesis. And I'm not afraid to talk about it and give you my reasons for it. But even then, I'm not like putting a stake in the ground and like defending it. You know what I mean? And I feel like that is maybe a little bit of a difference in terms of maybe some purposes that different people in the arena of ideas have. And I feel like maybe this is one of the reasons that I don't know if I could just say this. Like, I feel like I connect quickly with you because I feel like we have this in common. It's like we want to understand, okay, what's actually true in the meadow of reality? Like, not what can we defend on a picture of reality in somebody's cave,
Right.
where the cave is a place of shelter where people go and they come up with pictures. This is what I was saying kind of before the show is there's kind of this framing that I kind of want to share about the value that I feel like you bring to your audience, which I see it as a kind of challenge to those who might be defending a picture. So
Yeah.
like I have this picture, if I could just kind of lay this out and then we'll move into the
Sure.
universalist
Sure.
stuff, but I have this sort of picture of like the meadows of reality, and then there's infinite exploration. Like there's no end to the exploration of the meadows of reality. And then there are these places where people maybe sketch pictures of reality. They do kind of the best they can. And then crowds of people gather around these pictures and they start looking to the pictures for their reality. And I
Yeah.
sort of see you as somebody who maybe there was a picture you inherited from your youth, and then you kind of had that sort of curiosity and courage to kind of break out of that picture. And I saw your video where you were kind of telling your story, which I really enjoyed because you're,
Thank you.
telling your story about how you're starting to question things, and then you were still kind of defending certain things. And then as you kind of go out into the meadows of reality, it looks like you're finding things that aren't really fitting in that picture. The picture's too simple. And I love that. And I feel like I can really join you in that. And even as we talk about like universalism, my goal is to sort of think with you about how we can think about reality under a hypothesis that isn't necessarily in the frame of let's try to defend this particular picture, but more in the frame of let's see if we can explore a way in which reality can make the most sense under a certain hypothesis, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does. It does. And I guess I really just wanted to say that when I say of sorts is that there's apologists, there's philosophers who are primarily apologists who just want to defend, and then
Hmm.
there are a certain class of philosophers who will also defend your faith. You're not a pushover. You're going to say, no, I believe this, and here's why it's rational.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are, I guess, a class of theistic and atheistic philosophers of religion who will be like, no, the other side is rational, right?
Yeah.
They can defend this view. This is not
Yeah.
I'm going to premise 1, 2, 3, you better be a believer or you're irrational, or you better be an atheist if you're irrational. And
Yeah.
so I think that is one of the things I very much appreciate about you and a variety of other philosophers. So again,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, so it's not a battle over rationality, but it's an inquiry into reality. And I
Yes.
think sometimes we destroy the productive inquiry into reality when we polarize into groups and say, hey, not only are you wrong, but you're completely irrational. I mean,
Right.
it creates a certain kind of fun, certain kind of play, a game, a competition, but I don't think it's very productive for inquiry. So, yeah, so that's where I feel like maybe you and I have that in common, is we're sort of interested in trying to uncover more about reality.
So the topic I really wanted to talk about on universalism was this idea I had, and so one of the big things in my deconversion was the idea of hell and it being
Hmm.
just incomprehensibly unjust. If my theory was like if all these theodicies are true and God, if he has the option to create or not create, but if he creates and he creates people, then he necessarily must create a hell. then
Yeah,
th- then the only moral option is to not create at that point, right? If
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the only two things you could do, it's time to call it quits.
Can I
Uh,
ask you how did you kind of come to that sense?
so I mean, just like in terms of like anything that you kind of think about, like what it is about love, right?
Yeah.
Like what it means to love someone, and loving relationships was a big part of what made me kind of start questioning my Christian faith in the beginning. And it's
Hmm.
just I couldn't torture anything that I loved, right? And like it's so much like you could see a lot of suffering, and then but when you have to contemplate the idea of eternal conscious torture, it is literally the worst state of affairs that could exist, right? I like to say, I've had this argument with Christians. People will tell me, "How could you be an atheist? It's so horrific," and
Hmm.
and it's a Christianity so beautiful. And I was like, it's the exact opposite,
Hmm.
because on my view, nobody has to burn for all
Hmm.
eternity, right? This is infinitely better news than the good news of your bog standard, Christianity. The most common sort of Christianity is one with an eternal hell, right? And that really kind of a lot of times, if they're not familiar with the dialogue, that kind of takes people back and they go, oh, I never really thought about it that way. And I just
Yeah.
can't see how a loving being could do that, right?
Hmm.
And if you were truly a loving being and this is your two options, all right, I ain't creating nothing, right?
Yeah. If I could amplify what you're saying there, because I can relate to that. A question that I've asked students, I've asked people this sometimes, is like, if you were just going to be randomly plopped into a world, and here's one version of reality, uh, most people in that reality will end up suffering forever and ever and ever. Okay, for whatever reasons.
Right,
Okay. And you don't know before you're plopped into the world whether you're going to be one of them,
right.
right?
That's exactly it.
Um,
Yeah,
or you're plopped into a world. Let's go the sort of the eternal conscious torment world, the universalist world, which we'll talk about, and then an atheist world, right? So the universalist world you might think is, it's the best kind of reality we could even imagine, is that everybody's ultimately safe. There's no endless torment for anybody. But then let's go to the atheist world. In the atheist world, you're dropped in there and you're guaranteed to live a certain amount of time, and then die and then be gone out of reality. But there's no risk that you're going to be among the most of the majority of people who are suffering forever and ever and ever.
right,
And then I asked, well, which world would you rather be dropped into? And I think most people, it's almost like they take a certain comfort if they believe that they're safe. But as long as other people are suffering, then there's kind of this question about, okay, I mean, can you actually have happiness if you know that there is just suffering in reality forever and ever and ever? You know what I mean? And yes, there's ways of responding to that, but just to kind of step back and just frame it from the outside, like take yourself out of the world and just compare which world, which reality is like better.
right.
The one where there's most people are suffering forever and ever and ever for whatever reasons, or the one where like everybody lives a little bit and then just dies. And I mean, when you just put it that way, I could see how an atheistic vision of reality could be thought to be quite a bit better than the one where they're suffering for everybody, and especially if the suffering affects everybody else. It's your loved ones that are separated forever.
And I mean, that's its own special argument against the concept of heaven in the traditional Christian view, right? Where like, how could I be, how could I possibly be happy
Hmm.
if I knew my child, right, the most precious thing in my life, if my children are suffering in hell, like I couldn't. And it's like, well, God will just make you happy, and it's just like, talk about changing you in a way that I don't want to be changed, right? Like
Hmm.
I care. Like if you told me I can make you perfectly happy, but you're gonna forget your children exist, no, right?
Hmm.
It's like a pleasure machine, like a riff on the pleasure machine thought experiment,
Yeah,
uh,
just wipe your memories. Yeah,
right? And it's just like, well, no, I wouldn't want that. Like I have certain things that are that are that important to me.
yeah.
Um, and so I guess the part of the thing is I also looked at it was that and that's just what I found very interesting was that you didn't
Hmm.
deny this. I bring up one of the primary reasons I'm not agnostic at least is that I go look, an all loving and all powerful God could create what I call the heaven world, right?
Hmm.
Everybody, you don't start in an earth, you start in heaven, right? If libertarian free will is so important, but we don't have it in heaven, then why bother with the libertarian free will, right? Or
Hmm.
if you have it in heaven, but you won't sin, then God can create beings that by their nature would never choose to not do the good, I guess, right? And so, like you had brought up, hey, maybe that is the case, and
Yeah, follow your light, right? I
yeah,
mean, if your intuition is that, if God were real, then he would start us off in heaven, then, follow your light, follow your own inference, right?
right,
The inference isn't God is real and this is the case. It's rather that if God is real, this would be the case.
yep,
And so instead of saying, God isn't real because it isn't the case, if you're going to build an argument against theism, I just say follow your light. And I'm very open to that. I mean, it's I think part of a classic tradition that God, out of the stuff of existence, this personal stuff that's good and intelligent, emerges beings that are connected to God and safe and protected, and these we might call these angelic beings, and that it's a later development in the course of the unfolding of reality that there would be opportunities for certain kinds of, let's say, adventures in states of limitation, if I could use that language. And there's different models for how this might work, but I say, follow your light, because if you would sort of expect that if God were perfect, he would create all the beings starting in heaven, well, maybe that's the case then.
So that's a particularly interesting take on it. This is also one of the reasons why I like talking to
Yeah.
you, in
I'm not
that
looking at one of those pictures in one of those places. I'm looking at the meadows of reality and say, hey, maybe we can
you can
draw a bigger
accommodate
picture.
this. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, draw a bigger, but it's not without precedent. I mean, it is in the history of thinking about these things.
Yeah, so I was unaware of them actually until not that long ago.
Mhm.
But I mean I think there's definitely problems with that view, right? Like it's sort of, you know, I mean to be not to be too crass, but it's just like you're sitting there in heaven and you're like, well, I'm gonna step in the rape machine, right? Like because I mean there are horrific things,
Mhm.
right? I mean technically, if you want to go about it, and every embryo that gets created, like you're gonna step in that machine a whole bunch of times before you're gonna actually stay in there. You're gonna pop it. Nope, embryo died. Nope, embryo died. Didn't implant. Didn't implant. Didn't implant. All right, I'm in. Right, and it's like, oh, died in childbirth. Like there seems to be, and then I mean, then that's not even encountering the horrific chances, right? So the amount of people like, not that I like Dawkins, but his quote was like, we are the lucky one. The we who are alive are the lucky ones, right? We
Yeah.
survived. If you look at
Yeah,
the amount
so
of death
I'm
there is.
I'm sympathetic with what you're saying, and here I just wanna clarify, I mean, it's not this isn't really a theodicy here. I mean,
Hmm.
so if I'm thinking about, why is there the kinds of evils and sufferings in the world, then I have a set of considerations that kind of help me make sense of that. Um, but what I'm kind of thinking about is, like, if God exists, would he start beings in his presence? And I say follow your light on that, but I'm not saying that if God would do that, that's going to answer the problems of evil, that's going to explain why beings would experience horrific things. The suggestion is not that people choose to enter into this world in order to experience all of the suffering that they actually experience. In fact, I would say it's more like each person on this model would have some analysis of the risks and the benefits, and they would come into this world either by being created, or if they're given a choice because they start in the presence of God, it's with an understanding of some great purposes, purposes surrounding lessons in love, building of character, but also bringing beauty and order to a place that's not good. So it's like actually coming together, learning how to cooperate to bring goodness into a place. And it's not that people are coming in choosing to be raped or choosing to be a victim. It's more like people understand that when they come into this place, there's certain risks because this place is, in a sense, not already perfected. So now that's not a complete theodicy either, but I just want to clarify that starting in heaven idea is not all by itself a theodicy. It's not going to explain the things. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I wouldn't say that this view is problematic just in virtue of the fact that there have to be other sort of planks in one's worldview to understand all the observations, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. I guess I don't know the idea of stepping out into the it's like that original thought experiment of like,
Yeah.
would you want to step into this horrific? Would you step into this thing where the possibilities of horrificness is astounding, right? And then versus
Yes.
staying in
I think you would do it
paradise.
if you had the courage, you saw the benefits, and you really understood the value. Then I'm going to say, yeah, I think so. I think probably you
I
would.
guess I kind of have the problem of like what I also struggle with the idea of there's value in it that wouldn't already be present in heaven anyway, right?
Yeah. Tell me more about that. Yeah.
Well, again, so this also depends upon, I guess, the things that I was thought and is quite very popular in Christianity is that God ontologically grounds the good, right? He's the
Hmm.
locus of all value, right? He's supposed to
Hmm.
be a perfectly good being, and
Yeah.
so if you're in a perfectly good ever like and one of the things we're supposed to strive for, and this isn't just Christianity, but almost all theisms, is to strive to get closer to God, to grow in
Hmm.
relation, in ever deepening, loving relation with God, and that is the highest good. That's it. That's the highest good.
Hmm.
What more is there to do than that? And if there's some virtue to be developed, I want to get the virtue. You could be created with the virtue, right? You already have that disposition. You already know about. You could already even have the knowledge of how bad something is without having to have gone through it, right? It would be better. So it would be better to go through life knowing that being assaulted horrifically is bad and not being
Hmm.
assaulted than it is to know that it's bad to be assaulted and then live through a horrific beating that leaves you like,
Hmm.
that sort
Yeah.
of thing, right?
Yeah.
So
That makes sense.
yeah, so I don't see, like, I just don't see how what value there is to be gotten into the stepping through the machine or stepping into the world unless you want to take away that God grounds all value, right?
Hmm.
I think grounding value in God um, takes away from the idea of like the possibility of theodicy, right? That there's something we're gaining by going through the suffering.
Well, this is interesting because I'm thinking about ways in which a relationship can be experienced through a psychological sequence in a new way. I kind of have like two thoughts. One is about RTS games, which we got to come back and
We
talk
do have
about
to.
that because like why would people voluntarily limit themselves to these states of limitations with shapes on a screen, and suffer in the battle? I know this is different than the physical pains, but I do want to come back to that. But I was thinking about my firstborn because when he was born, I didn't have that kind of emotional connection with him. But my wife did because, well, I think her connection with him was more biological. And so right when he was born, there was just that feeling of like, oh, this is my baby. But I didn't actually feel that particular connection with him. And it's interesting
Really?
how going through, yeah, I guess maybe I'm defective in this way. I mean, I was happy that he was here, right?
Right.
But there's something about going through experiences with him that have created bonds of connection with him. And these are experiences of good and bad. And the bad experiences, I'm thinking now of when he was learning how to use the bathroom and he missed
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he
you
was
deal with that.
crying and suffering. And I held him and he felt so ashamed. I said, "Oh, it's okay." And I helped him clean it up. And of course, like as a parent, I would want to prevent that. I wouldn't want him to experience that. But it's also the case that actual experiences lead to qualities and kinds of relationship and connection that seem to be connected to those experiences. And I've been wondering a lot recently about the difference between a kind of like magical view of fundamental reality, where fundamental reality could just do things that just are impossible, versus a view of fundamental reality that's connected to, let's say, psychological laws, like necessities of nature, that provide certain important constraints, so that like even a personal being at the foundation of reality is engaged in forging relationships with us through experiences. And it can't like skip that. It would be sort of like getting to the end of a movie and, hey, let's just have the last scene of the movie where the hero comes in and rescues the situation. Let's not go through the sequences that lead to that. It's like part of the meaning of that final episode of that movie is the psychological sequence that leads to that. And so I guess that's where I would sort of think about there being different kinds of value in connection with God or in relationship that is not just automatic. Like it actually does come through the pathway of experience, it seems to me.
So, in that sort of a view, I guess the sort of response I have to that is, first is the plithy, funny part of it of like, I think you're borrowing from the naturalist worldview, um,
Absolutely.
in order to, so you must sit upon Dennett's lap in order to slap his face. So the idea is that, well, look, I mean, we live in a naturalist universe. We evolved, and the only way we can get new capabilities is to go through painful growth, right? Suffering, there's no pain, no gain is actually kind of real in a very real way. You have to
Yeah.
fail in order to grow, and so I think that sort of thing makes sense in a naturalistic universe. But on a theistic universe, God, and especially if you're a Christian and you believe in the Trinity and God is relational into himself somehow, right? Let's just
Hmm.
grant the Trinity and all that. And you go, there was no growing, there was no pain, there was no suffering, there was none of that. It was just perfect relation always, right? There's none of this. And so to say that, well, then, there's something special to be gained by going through the painful experiences is to say that we have something that God doesn't, right?
Well, yeah,
And
I
that
would say
seems
that.
to
And it's something very special and very important. It's part of why God would be interested in expanding into a diversity of beings, is to experience a diversity of relationships and kinds of growth and discovery, and even discovery of aspects of himself vicariously through these different beings. And that actually, it's so funny that you mentioned the naturalism, because I don't want to slap Daniel Dennett's face. I like Daniel Dennett. But it's so interesting to me, John, because before you mentioned that, right at the moment that you mentioned that, I was thinking in my mind, I had this thought in my mind that you wouldn't witness by looking at the particles in my brain. Okay. Not directly. But I was thinking in my mind, and I know this by introspection, I was thinking in my mind that is actually the opposite. That in order for there to be evil, pain, suffering, it's unlikely that if you turn on a TV screen and there's white noise, that just through mindless causes, an epic drama is going to emerge out of the white noise. Whereas it seems to me way more likely that I would see negative states in correlation with positive states, pains that lead to gain, in a world that's not fundamentally mindless. It seems to me. So it actually does. I mean, I'm just being very honest about it. Like it does look
sure.
to me. I'm not trying to like win an argument here. It appears to, and I could be wrong, but it appears to me that there's a way in which you kind of have to borrow from the theistic ontology to make evil and suffering unlikely in a sense, because evil and suffering are the kinds of things that I think make sense in the context of moral arenas that would be so unlikely to emerge out of the mindless quantum field to me. That's kind of one of my biggest, I don't know, like maybe obstacles to maybe a worldview that's fundamentally mindless, is like it just doesn't seem like you're going to get the dramas of life that we witness.
So I guess it's a completely different argument to go down, I think. But so I mean, I lean towards the more I've studied it, and I've spent a lot of time. Ironically, counter apologetics and losing my faith is what made me fall in love with philosophy.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that made me go deep in philosophy was like, let me counter this moral argument, right? And then it was just like, oh man, I read stuff for like 2 years. And the more I study it, honestly, the more I kind of lean towards a sort of anti-realism, or like morality being a social construct that
Hmm.
is more like a herd morality, right? So like people like to quote Michael Ruse, apologists like to quote Michael Ruse as of like, it's like a sort of a, morality is not really real. There's not a metaphysical substrate or thing that is morals, right? It's
Uh-huh.
just we're a social we evolved to be a social species. We're not like sharks where we're individualistic, right? We have to cooperate in order to survive as a species, and so a sort of herd morality evolved from that. So you don't actually get to be subjective and choose like, oh, murder's okay today, right?
Hmm.
You just it's basically like a species based moral system, and I don't see that really being a problem. Now we can have the argument: is
Sure.
could a mind of sorts evolve from a mindless reality? Right, that's its own special form of kind of an argument. But I like presuming you grant that, right, that we have some sort of a mind, whether deterministic of whatever it is, right?
Hmm.
Um, but like that, once you have it, that we would get a sort of moral system of good and what we call good and bad, good for, bad for, that sort of thing. I don't see that as very hard. Once you've gotten the mind part, you're done, right? It's not unreasonable to me to get there. So the argument would shift more or less from moral to, are we going to have the mind emerge at all from a mindless reality?
I think that's a perceptive point, and I agree that having a mind there is going to help. And even when I think about moral data, one of the moral data points that's interesting to me, it doesn't include there's an objective moral law out there. It's just that there's even the sense that something's negative or bad, or the sense that something's good. And that's different than the sense that something's like cold, or the sense that something's hot. These are like different senses, right? And so I guess it seems to me that you could have consciousness and it doesn't sort of by itself predict that there's going to be any kind of moral arena. And especially, I mean, this is where it just like it gets me. When you get the specific kinds of connections between good states and negative states that kind of make sense of a story, like a real story in which beings are working out virtues, they're building relationships, they're discovering each other in new ways. And I would insist on that it's, I don't think it's metaphysically possible to achieve all these discoveries apart from certain kinds of experience sequences. And so, whether God has to look into the future to get those experience sequences, or he gets them in an open future vision of reality, kind of my working model is that God experiences the unfolding of reality. And this is how even God can experience some of these values through the negative states, right? And I guess the point here is that I think you're right that mind helps. I think that's absolutely right. But I don't see that mind all on itself, on its own, is going to predict the specific kind of consciousness that's relevant to negative states. It seems to me.
So there was like
Yeah.
three different things that I was just
Yeah.
like
Go ahead.
wanting to do. No, 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 it's fine. I really don't want to touch on all of them just because I wanted to get to the main topic. But
Yeah.
like the idea was that it's like, well, like, moral senses are not like it's being cold, like bad for negative states are not the same as being cold. I kind of like, isn't it though? Like it kind of feels like to me that yeah, it sort
Being
of
cold is
is.
well, I guess if you're too cold, right?
Right, that's it.
You
So
hate
there's
it.
certain things that are bad for you, right? Things that are bad for you based on the brute facts of your biology, because everything ends in bruteness, Josh. um, is that there are certain things that like that's how it comes about, right? And so whether it's the amoeba shying away from the bleach chemical, right, or us being too cold or not being fed, needing food, that sort of a thing, and then when my offspring is suffering or dying or something like that,
Mm,
that's bad because, and I have an intrinsic value towards my offspring because the evolutionary pressures are making me care about it because the entire purpose is to reproduce,
yeah.
right? So I think I guess that's where I would start to question and challenge
Yeah. Well,
that.
in a way, I kind of want to affirm what you're saying because I sort of think about these specific kinds of consciousness as being more specific than just the general idea that there is consciousness, because now you're talking about the kind of consciousness that's sensitive to feeling like this is a bad state. It's not just like a pencil that gets destroyed or something, or a machine that's self-replicating and it gets destroyed And while it's getting destroyed, it has the feeling of like thinking about lollipops or something like this. There's something more connected to its survival. And I actually think that of that in terms of a specific kind of value as well. So I want to just affirm that I think consciousness definitely does help. But this is part of the big question. What is the most probable explanation? So I don't want to keep us on this topic because I know
Yeah.
you want to move into universalism.
Yeah. I guess the thing is about universalism, right? Is that so? I don't want to go into the objections against it. So let's say the thing I came up with, I like to call it the rascal's wager, sort of like a
Okay.
riff on Pascal's wager, where
Hmm.
you say, oh, you look at the alternatives, and it's just better. It's better to bet on believing in being a Christian other than the alternative, because if you're wrong, you burn in hell, and if not, you go to heaven. And so the idea was, well, if I'm an atheist, and so part of the problem of all of these philosophical and metaphysical arguments is they're just so indeterminative, right? You cannot prove it, right? And so you have people, the the people who study this the most, I seem to find, are the most open to saying the opposing side is rational, right? You
Hmm.
can look at the metaphysics and reasonably come to a different conclusion. You can make your own case that has pluses and minuses. And so you go, look, I'm convinced there is no God.
Hmm.
I see a plurality of religions in front of me, but I've become convinced that if a God existed, then a hell couldn't exist, and universalism of sorts is true.
Hmm.
Well, then, practically speaking, what motivation do I have left to convert to any given religion? If I'm
Hmm.
wrong and God does exist, then I'm going to heaven anyway, right? So it's like an inverse of Pascal's wager. And so
Yeah.
it's funny because I saw um, the sort of bad, what I consider the bad apologetics, like popular websites, where they were arguing against annihilationism and universalism, where they were using this as a sort of uh, an argument against it, where it just says, well, if my child has a bedtime at 8 o'clock and I go into their room at 7:59 and I go, you didn't clean your room, you're going right to bed. That's not a punishment, right? Because they expect to go to bed then. So the
Hmm.
annihilationist, to say that annihilationism is true to an atheist, are like, well, that's happening anyway. What reason do I have to
Hmm.
convert? And if it's
Hmm.
even more so for the universalist, because it's just like, well, even if you're wrong, you get all the goods. So what reason is there to convert? And I hate
Hmm.
being on that side of the fence, but practically speaking, there's a logic there.
Yeah, I think I appreciate this because I think it does kind of pick out a certain theology,
Hmm.
maybe several different theologies at once, but one kind of theology that comes to my mind is sort of this idea that there's like this golden ticket to get to heaven, and you earn it, or maybe you get it by grace, but there's something that you do, and then you sort of merit this result, right? And then if you're going to get that result anyway, if you're going to win the game anyway, you're going to get the ticket to
Yeah, no matter
Disneyland or
what. Yeah.
whatever it is, right? Then why what motivation, what practical motivation is there to get the ticket now or to convert to a religion? Yeah,
Very important
go ahead.
point, and this only makes sense, I think, in the context of I'm convinced atheism is true, because
Hmm.
obviously, if I became convinced that God existed and universalism was true, I would still follow the God because the God is the good, right? Like you have to,
Yeah,
like that would be a motivation in and of itself, right? So it's not like I'm gonna do what I want, right?
well, that's good. Yeah,
That's a different foible here. So this is more
yeah.
on the lines of if you're an agnostic or an atheist, and universalism is true, what motivation do I have to even bother? Why do I even bother reading the philosophy? Why do I even bother reading
Hmm.
and trying to see which religion is there, or even in playing the game, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're convinced, then you're not looking at it. Maybe, I mean, you could be curious to see if maybe there's something you haven't seen, but I mean, the first thing I want to sort of emphasize is that I don't know if psychologically you could just like choose to believe something against what you're
Right.
convinced of. In fact, it might, if there is an objective morality, it might even be objectively morally wrong to sort of hide your head in the sand and violate your own sense of what seems true, like by your own light. I mean, if somebody says, "Hey, Josh, like if you believe there's an elephant in the room, then you'll go to heaven." And by the way, you'll go to heaven anyway.
Right.
right? Then I'm like in your position because it's like, well, I don't think I really can't believe in that elephant, and then I'm probably going to raise the same question you just raised, like, and what value is there, even if I could do that, since I'm going to go to heaven anyway? And maybe the answer is, well, I mean, there's some value in having that connection with God. But you just said that if you're an atheist, you're convinced that there isn't this sort of fundamental goodness, this fundamental intelligence. Then I guess I'm kind of just with you. Like, I mean, how can I answer that? But like, agree that that's, I think, a challenge for a certain kind of theology. In fact, I think there's a value in the challenge because I think it helps to maybe expose a problematic theology, a theology that would sort of be an incorrect view of God if God were real, and maybe would even create an unnecessary obstacle to other visions of fundamental reality that might be theistic, but not leading to that problem. I mean, because it is a problem that I would have to believe something against all of my evidence. If I'm convinced, how can I choose to do that? I don't see how I could do that.
So
Now, if it's a live option, it might be different.
unlike certain apologists, I would say I think the technical term would be doxastic voluntarism is false. I
Yeah,
can't choose my
right.
beliefs, right? I cannot choose to believe something,
Directly, not
right?
directly.
Not
Yeah,
directly, yeah. So the thing would be like an indirectly, right? So if it was something along the
yeah.
lines of, you know, and this I think really does tie to the utter indeterminacy of metaphysical questions and metaphysical arguments.
Hmm.
I I've been interested in this for roughly a decade, and I'm sure you've been doing this for far longer. But when I look at this and I go, if you want to be a theist, you will find the reasons. You will find the arguments convincing that will lead you to theism, and then you will find the arguments for the religion that you want to be true, I think, to be convincing. Because you can find whatever you want, really, when you go into these arguments. And that also sort of applies, I think, also in the political arena. It's not just metaphysics, but
Hmm.
because you can reduce political questions down to metaphysical questions, I think. Um,
Hmm.
but you can get there. And so if I was just like really trying to become a theist, right? Like let's
Yeah.
say my wife like became converted, and the only way I'm going to save my marriage and my family that I
Hmm.
hold so dear is that I have to become a believer. Would I be? I would be hitting those books, and I think I think so. It's more of a you could put yourself you could will yourself on the path, and I think
Hmm.
you'll get there. I think you could get there if you really were motivated. But the question is should do I want to be motivated to get there, right? And
Hmm.
so a Pascal's wager would if it wasn't for the I think the many gods objection, it would certainly be a
Hmm.
a,
Yeah,
a
no,
very
that's
motivating
very
thing.
interesting. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I was actually kind of thinking again about the eternal conscious torment view because maybe one sort of advantage if somebody holds that view, if they agree that their view of reality is not like the best view in the sense that it's the most exciting of all the views,
Yes.
maybe they could sort of resist the accusation of following the wishful thinking path. That's kind of a side point there,
Yeah.
but what you're saying is very interesting, and I am a big believer in people seeking the truths that are the treasures in their own life that kind of are the most relevant to them, because I sort of think of like truths as a set of keys that they unlock doors, and not every door has to be unlocked by like every person at every time. So there's like different people, and so, I mean, I kind of think that there's value in pathways where you're pursuing the truths that are building up your life in a way that's meaningful. And then I was going to ask you, are you familiar with John Sanders' work on soteriology?
I am not.
So he believes in a kind of soteriological inclusivism, which C.S. Lewis illustrates this in his The Last Battle of the Narnia series, where the idea is that you can have a kind of connection with the good or with God, even if you wouldn't think of that connection in terms of God.
Yeah, so the like if you were a Hindu and you tried to be a devout like Muslim or Hindu or pick something, you're like I was trying to please God and I thought this was the way, and then at the end of it, God was like, oh, you were worshiping me you really
It's
were
it's
actually
like
doing that.
it's like that, but let me kind of draw this out a little bit
Sure.
because I like in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, he uses this example of somebody who's serving, I think it was Tash, and like Tash represents the negative being. So like Tash is like bad, okay?
Yes.
But this person is seeking the good in what they perceive Tash to be.
Hmm.
And so then at the end of the book, it's like Aslan comes back or whatever, returns, and this character in the book is kind of nervous and embarrassed, like, oh man, like I was like in the wrong religion, you could say, right?
Yeah.
And what Aslan says is that actually, what you did out of the good, or the real good, you were doing it for me, because whatever is good is within me, and so I took it that way. And I've thought that sometimes people can actually get more acquainted with elements of goodness, sometimes by having a certain vision of God or even a kind of religious characterization of reality smashed and shattered. And I was actually kind of wondering about this with your story. I mean, I thought that there were elements of your story that I thought it sounds like you're kind of expanding your um, empathy for certain kinds of people. It sounds like that, and it sounded beautiful to me. Like it sounded like you were advancing in your connection with aspects of goodness through your story. And John Sanders would say, "Well, that's great. That's actually advancing your relationship with God, literally."
So I would definitely, so I would relate that in a far more psychological way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this comes and comes back to the, your view so horrible. Well, no, my view nobody burns. Was that, especially when I think back to being a Christian, especially at a young age, I was in the Christian schools. I was basically surrounded
Mhm.
by almost everybody who I was around and cared about was in
Yeah.
the group. Everybody was in the in group. I had nobody on the
Mhm.
out group. Everybody, and especially, and so this was key to my deconversion. Gay people, especially, were in the out group, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so once I had a friend who came out as gay, and then I met their partner. My wife and I, we were close friends. They became very close friends with them and their partner, and we saw that they were as in love as we were. And
Mhm.
then my wife at the time, this was before we had kids. We're very lucky we deconverted before we had kids, I think. Um, in that we said, they have what we have. How could that be wrong? And if that's not wrong, what else is in the Bible is not correct? And how can a loving God send somebody like them to hell? And when you start worrying, and I remember before deconversion, I had this thing where I was just terrified that I didn't these certain people who I really cared about, I didn't know if they were saved, and I was like trying
Mhm.
to witness to them, and sometimes it went well, and sometimes it did not. And part of it, I remember a friend was just like, I'd have to believe everyone in my family who's ever lived is in hell right now if what you're telling me
Mhm.
is true.
Yeah.
You're like, you're crazy. Right? And like that one hit me, and that was years
Yeah.
before I deconverted actually.
Mhm.
um, and so like I think the empathy sphere, it becomes harder I think to hold to the exclusivist and eternal conscious torture
Mhm.
once your empathy sphere is sort of forcibly expanded. um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that connects very well with,
with what you're
you know,
saying, yeah.
Sanders' eschatological system, and he makes a case for it, from a Christian perspective. But whether you take it from a Christian perspective or any other perspective, I think it is kind of an interesting model because, I mean, just kind of all my cards on the table. Like, I think that you have advanced. Like, I think you're closer. Like, if God is real, okay, I think you're closer to God now than you were. I think you've advanced, and I mean that
I
most
mean,
sincerely.
there's been a lot of blasphemy, I'm not gonna lie. Afterwards, there's been a very big lot of blasphemy, especially as far as you're concerned. So that does seem a bit odd to me. I get what you're saying, and I appreciate that.
Well,
I
but maybe
do.
even
Yeah.
kind of the way that you're thinking about blasphemy might be sort of in relation to a vision of what you think God might approve or disapprove. And maybe that God just doesn't exist and you discovered that. That's progress. Maybe the stuff of existence is sort of different. It's not anthropomorphized in the way that we anthropomorphize God and religion. And I want to be careful here because I do not want to simplify what you're suggesting at all. In fact, it's the opposite. I actually kind of want to put a light on what I feel like is very valuable about your journey. That when I was watching your story, thought, well, that's actually inspiring. And I think that this kind of relates back to that picture that I was kind of describing at the beginning, where there are these shelters where I think people put up these pictures. It's kind of their best guesses of reality, or maybe they've looked at reality and they've come up with a picture, but a picture is always limited. It's just always limited. And you come out of a place where crowds are looking at a picture, you see a bigger vision of reality, and then I'm just kind of interpreting it kind of from where I'm at and thinking, well, that kind of makes sense. Actually, I feel like that sort of fits, kind of makes sense, even though it can be interpreted in different ways. But I do hope we can come back to this point about the uncertainty of metaphysical systems,
Yes.
because here's a distinction that I think gets lost in social media land and just kind of in many lands, which is the difference between a reasonable debate versus a lack of having knowledge. So let me just kind of highlight this with two
Please.
examples where I think you and I will agree that we probably have knowledge, but I think there can be reasonable debate about this. So one example would be that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that's true. Okay, do you agree with that one?
Yes.
Okay, would you say you know that that's true?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to come back to that one. Another one would be that we can have thoughts. Do you think that one's true?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I have to have a thought in order to know it, right? So.
Okay, good. And you think you know that you have thoughts. Okay, because I'm with you here. And then this is the thing that's happened to me is I think that it is possible to know that we have thoughts, and it is possible to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that's true. But then I've encountered very intelligent people arguing against the existence of thoughts, like Alexander Rosenberg, philosopher of science, and people arguing against 2 plus 2 equaling 4 being true. These fictionalist philosophers, like Mark Balaguer, for example. And as I'm reading their works and working through them, I can't say that they're unreasonable. Like I think they are reasonable, that there's a reasonable debate even here. Okay. And I want to just emphasize this because it can seem that there's a reasonable debate and nobody really knows. But there can also be cases where it actually seems by your light that there's a reasonable debate, but that you do
And
know.
I just know, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I see where you're going. I see where you're going with that. So the only concern I have there is that when you get into those sorts of things about like a fictionalist about math, right? And you go 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this is assuming a very basic, very general context that we would have in a conversation like this every
Yeah.
day, and that I'm, implicitly accept by even having a conversation, accept the classical laws of logic from which I could derive the Zeno-Franco,
Yeah.
plus maybe the Zeno-Franco plus choice axioms
Nice.
that underlie the mathematical statement 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? So it's just
Yeah.
all within that context, and then
Yeah.
we're gonna have that philosopher who's going into this is about fictionalism, about math, about whether that corresponds to a very real thing, and so if it doesn't correspond to a very real thing, then it's not actually real, and therefore it is not true, right? So like you
Yeah.
get into like you
Yeah.
can drill that down, right? And so
That's
you could
it.
say well, actually in that context, I have no freaking idea, right? So like if we're gonna go in that way, are mathematical objects real? Are they really like a metaphysical thing that's out there, or is it something we've invented? And like that,
Well, I
that
know,
like that's that I got no idea, you know.
yeah. Well, so there's a cluster of things where there's a kind of murky metaphysics there, and that some of these arguments are going to dip the spoon into that murky metaphysics in support of something that even in their own terms they're saying this is sort of like folk ontology. This is the common sense view, and we don't mean anything like deep and metaphysical when we say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. We mean even the lightweight existence is gone. Or going back to thoughts, I've been just reading all this neuroscience, and they're talking about theory of mind. Theory of mind, that's the ordinary belief that there are thoughts and beliefs, and there are other minds. And absolutely, once you get into the arguments, you're now moving into deep and difficult metaphysical territory. But the point is that people are dipping their spoon or their cup into that territory to make what I want to say are reasonable arguments for conclusions that I think it is possible to know that some of these things are true or not true, even if we don't have let's say, consensus. We haven't resolved reasonable disagreement. And I just kind of want to lay out that distinction here because I think that's kind of how I feel about some of these questions about maybe the existence of God or universalism. Like, I think there can be reasonable disagreement, but I don't want to suggest, and maybe this is more for the audience, like, I don't want to suggest that, therefore, I don't think that one can know these things because
Of
I think
course
it is
not.
possible.
No, certainly, certainly. And we both say, I know there is no God. You'll tell me, there is a God, and that's,
Mhm.
and we each have our ways of approaching that. I think, I guess the thing about, um, I guess what sort of gets me, and you know what, this argument wouldn't work very well against you because you're a universalist, which is why you're so fun to talk to. But I would just say, like,
Because your arguments don't work against me.
that's
That's why.
right. That's right. Because the idea would be, if I would look at this and I go, well, you dip that cup in that well of murky metaphysics, and it's just like, I don't have this problem with the sun. It goes, look, the sun. God
Mhm.
exists. Jesus is the Son of God. Show up, because
Mhm.
dying, resurrecting, but then ascending into heaven looks a whole lot like being dead. Right?
Mhm.
So guy could have just stuck around. We could be talking to him for 2,000 years, and
Mhm.
this would be there would be no real questions about this, right? Like, it doesn't have to be. This is the hiddenness argument, effectively.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you're like, if especially if there's so much at stake here, right?
Yeah.
Then this makes no sense to me. Like, why do I
Yeah.
have to? There was no Abraham did not have to dip his cup into the murky metaphysics and think about the contingency argument to be, oh, God exists and wants me to go over there. No, God
Yeah.
spoke to him directly in his mind, right? So, like,
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right that in a way it doesn't work against my view, not just because of the universalism, but also the inclusivism. And here I actually want to kind of join you and say this is where I love the sort of counter apologetics, because the counter apologetics challenges some pictures of fundamental reality that I think really need to be challenged. There are theologies that frame the way a fundamental reality would relate to us if it were God that I think aren't true. And I feel like what you're raising here highlights that, like the idea that the most important thing to get that ticket to heaven is to know a proposition about the existence of God in a certain form of a religion, rather than having connections with the good, the true, and the beautiful in various experiences of life, where that's actually, that in a sense, if you think of the word truth there as meaning originally reality, I'm the way, the truth, I'm the way, the reality, and the life, you're coming, in a sense, to God through the reality, the truth. And I mean, think about that. Like, what would you rather have a relationship with your wife where she knows you on levels of understanding your who you are, um, but doesn't have all the sort of propositional beliefs about the metaphysical structure of, like, the parts of your body, or the psychological aspects of your mind that are not relevant to connection? I think you'd rather have the sort of real meaningful connection in terms of relationship there. It doesn't have to include the sort of cognitive aspects, it seems to me.
agreed. The one thing I do kind of want to poke at, just a little bit on the
Yeah.
universalism scale, and I say your view is that, on the universalist thing, you die. Somebody dies. Is there a do you think there's a purgatory style period if you weren't a believer that you have to treadmill through in order to get
No.
up into heaven, or is it like an immediate?
Well, no, it doesn't really translate in those terms for me because, I mean, I'm not you, so I don't know the details of your life. But in my sort of framework, I think of you as having various forms of connection with what I would call the stuff of existence, with God. And whether we use that label or not, I don't really think about your explicit propositional belief in a particular, like, God of a religion as being a requirement for that alignment, with reality, if that makes sense.
Uh,
So I don't think of that purgatory. Now, it could be that there are some religious people who go into a purgatorial state because they they're not learning the lessons of love, and they need that purgatory
So
to
no,
learn,
I guess
if that makes sense.
my question was more not specifically about me. It was more about the general. Is there, like, you die, judgment thing, heaven, or
Mhm.
you die and then maybe the believers or the people who, in that inclusivist view, grew close to God, they got the magic ticket. They skipped they got the fast pass to heaven.
Mhm.
Everybody else is schlepping it in the 3 hour line to go, or however long it is. Like I don't know if they're
Mhm.
is it just underdetermined? You don't know.
Well, so I love this question. You're familiar with that sheep's and goats passage where
Hmm.
the idea is that there's the sheep and the goats are separated, and then there's this line about how the sheep are told, when I was hungry, you fed me, and when I was naked, you gave me something, to wear, you clothed me. And they're like, well, when did you do that? Like, when did we do that? And then, the being is saying to them, you did it when you did it for the least of these. You did it unto me. And so I think there really is that sort of sense in which the dividing line really isn't maybe kind of the way that sometimes religious people will divide that line. It sort of reminds me of, I was thinking again about the Jews, not all of them, but like some of them at the time of Jesus, and Jesus comes up to them, some of them, and begins to talk about their evangelism. And I was thinking about this, like they might not know what Jesus is going to say, so maybe they're waiting for that compliment, like, "Hey, you guys, you go land and sea to make a single convert." And they're like, "Oh yeah, we go land and sea to make a single convert. We're so zealous." And Jesus is like, "To make them twice as much a son of hell as you are," right? And he's like saying this to the religious leaders, and I'm just thinking about that because there's ways in which I think we draw the lines of the sheep and the goats kind of according to maybe systems that we're familiar with. And I don't know. I mean, NDE reports, when they report an experience of coming into that being of love and light, it doesn't look like the dividing line is per religion so much as per um, lessons in love. It seems like that's the theme. Like the thing that really mattered was, did I love? And it's like there's these challenges. How am I going to love in this situation? How am I going to love in this situation? And that creates experiences, that creates an understanding and awareness. And so I kind of think about it like that. Does that mean that there's no hell? Well, I wouldn't say that because there are NDE experiences and there's biblical data and data from different traditions that would point to the idea that there can be experiences that, yeah, I would say are in the end purgatorial. Uh, they do something for you. But it's kind of like what you were saying earlier about the pain and the gain. It's like there's something about the negative states that can do things that positive states can't do. And so maybe there are contexts. I've been thinking about this in terms of a beckoning. We can explore the negative regions of reality, but the more that we explore those, the more severe we feel the negative. And you can understand this in your terms, in terms of a kind of subjective experience. But that negative experience calls us back. And I guess I've been kind of thinking that at the limit case, the experience would be so intense that nobody could sort of willfully remain separated from the good forever and ever and ever. And that's kind of why I would think they would all come back. But do you notice that the dividing lines here aren't in terms of like propositional beliefs,
Certainly
the way
no.
that I'm thinking about? Yeah.
Yeah, but now you're getting to the heresies of works getting your way into heaven, right? So,
Well, it can
um,
be still by grace that when
sure.
you're
Well,
aligned with the good, you receive
okay,
that forgiveness and help. Yeah.
all right. So but you're still getting the works are getting you the fast pass, I guess.
Well,
the
if heresy means that somebody's picture didn't
I
get reality
I
right,
know, I
I got no
know.
problem. Yeah, no, I'm playing with you
I
because I feel like that's an important point to
right.
challenge the pictures.
I get that. I guess part of the other thing is like so, and this was another one of those like annihilationists would try to say
Mm,
to fend off the thing I brought up at the beginning of like, oh well, if I just die, I don't care. I'm expecting that anyway. It ceases to exist.
mhm,
And they're like, well, they'll suffer for a while first, and then God will let them expire. And it's just like, well,
mhm,
even that doesn't comport to me with a loving God. Like there cannot be a state of you're in conscious tormented fire,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
Like all of those biblical things. Like you said, there are near death experiences where people think they've experienced that. And there's also near death
mhm.
experiences where people experience a very Hindu heaven or a very Muslim heaven, right? So
No,
uh,
no, no, I have to disagree with that. I've looked at more than 1,000 of these, and there's unifying themes across cultures. I've looked at Hindu ones, Muslim ones, Christian ones, and they're often against their own religious and cultural expectations,
Yeah,
actually.
that's what I mean. You mean
Yeah, well, but there's not like a Muslim. I mean, sorry, I probably maybe misunderstood. There's not like a Hindu sort of version of heaven and like a Muslim version of
but
heaven.
they think they see
There's
Shiva or something, or Brahma. I'm blanking on the name, but they think they see Allah and Muhammad, so to speak, right?
Sometimes they'll see representatives from their culture, although it is interesting how many people from different traditions would see a being of light and love that wouldn't identify in terms of a representative from their culture. And actually, I mean, I'm open to seeing more cases, but there was one from India and she saw a being of light. And when she was reporting it to the audience, she used an avatar from her religious culture to name it, but it wasn't part of the content of the experience that it named itself with that particular name, which isn't to say that there couldn't be experiences like that. Um, that's why I would kind of make a distinction between the interpretation of the experience and the content of the experience. And it seems from my looking at these cases that the contents are remarkably consistent, and there's a core there. Um, that is not culturally dependent. In fact, it often goes against cultural expectations, where, let's say, Christians, for example, don't expect to have this experience of coming back to a place that they felt that they had been before, because as part of their theology, that there was no place that they were in existence before. Or there was a case where somebody said that they had the experience of leaving their body, but it was part of their religion that they didn't have a separate essence that could be separated from their body. Rather, they'd be recreated with a new body. And so then they left their religion. Actually, a lot of people have these NDEs, will leave their religion or see something within their religious tradition that's bigger. And that to me is quite interesting because I would kind of expect that if these are dreams and hallucinations, they would just be having experiences that would kind of correlate with their expectations. And that's not what I'm finding
So
from these.
I've heard a lot of the unifying, like a being of light, or a
Mhm.
feeling of just love, sort of a thing. But then
Yeah.
I've also read accounts of I saw Allah and there was Muhammad, and there were accounts of, and I'm blanking on all the Hindu deities, but they saw, like, there were specific Hindu it was they were described in terms of the Hindu religion, right? And
It would be
so
interesting to see that source because somebody did say that they had those accounts too, and when I asked them, then they sent me an article, and when I chased it to the primary source, it wasn't that. They saw higher beings, you could call them angels, but and some of them maybe self-disclosed. Some of them they interpreted in the context of their culture, which is consistent with the idea of there being higher beings. Um, so I mean, it'd be interesting actually to kind of get your sources on that. For me, I would
okay,
love that.
so
I
I
mean,
mean,
I could, yeah.
I could tell you I have not delved deep. I mean, I've read about, like, I've read reports on articles of this sort of a thing, of like,
Mhm.
here was this case of a person in India that had this, and then they thought it was, they said it was this, it looked like this deity that they believed that it was, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you have done, as a philosopher, done far more in depth than what I've seen, but I suppose I shall have to go in and more investigate to look for those.
I mean, and I'm sure that there are these cases where they're going to interpret those experiences and that they're going to have experiences that will be meaningful to them because I have seen those cases as well. Um,
But I mean, if
that
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 exists,
is a big
though,
topic. Yeah.
but if you're looking at the evidence of, like, an NDE, and you go, well,
Sure.
hey,
Yeah.
and I see it, you could say, well, you interpreted it in terms of that. But if it says that, well, no, I saw whatever this deity was, and that was my NDE, then that goes back into the atheist, or not the non-theistic view of, this is all just, something happening in the mind while they're near death, because it's the contradictory nature of it, and, like, the being localized. And I'm certain that you can pick out um common themes, right? The feeling of love, right? People go to heaven. What do you think's in what do you think you're going to feel in heaven? Right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's effectively, like, this peaceful, loving, like like sensation, I think, right?
Yeah. I could say with a bit of confidence, I've not seen any reports that contradict any other reports, and I've seen probably thousands of these. And I'm talking about when I look for the primary source where they're giving the report. So I'm always open to that. And if there is a report that contradicts another report, that would be great. That would help me. I mean, so if
You know,
anybody watching this knows of that, send me an email, and I would love to update my view on that.
why don't you help us? And you don't have to do it certainly now. But I would certainly tweet it out or put it in the description after the fact. If you
Mhm,
had, is there a resource that goes into near-death experiences,
mhm.
like a collection of these, like a book or something like that that could
Yeah,
be
sure.
read?
Okay.
That would be very nice. Help you, help me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
And of
I'll
course, and I could definitely be wrong. I mean, I'm often wrong. So so I appreciate
let
the
me know what
opportunity
that's
to be
like. No.
more. Yeah. Okay.
So I think we're at 9:13. I'm willing to go more if you are, but I don't want to take up your time. I know it's getting probably close to dinner for you.
It's okay. I was trying to remember, we were unpacking something. I felt like we chased a branch down a leaf, and I'm not sure if we completed the branch. I'm trying to remember where we were coming from exactly.
Oh
We
gosh.
we got into NDEs, and that was related to after I think it had to do with the dividing line.
Yeah.
Um,
What? So is there
yeah.
even a dividing line? Right? Is there a purgatory? And I think if you say like there's anything that even remotely resembles what the Bible describes as hell, right? And I know that's the primary objection I see to universalism. And it's just like I love it. God couldn't do that, right? Like even us, we have there's an amendment. We would call that a fundamental constitutional right, which many Christians will tell you come from God.
Mm,
That you cannot torture someone. It's a violation of human rights. And you're like, but there's a hell, and you're gonna burn in the fire, and it won't die, and the worms shall eat your flesh forever, or whatever. And
yeah.
and so like a God couldn't even do that in my view, right?
I'm glad we found our way back to this because
Yeah,
I wanted to kind of focus on this a little more with you.
sure.
I hear you saying that like even a purgatorial hell, that's not cool, right? Because you're not going to throw your kids, like let's say your kids are doing something that
Yeah,
you feel like is harmful, so you just throw them into the fire pit for a while.
yeah.
They're like, "Daddy, please no!" Like, oh, you got to go. You just
You
got to go
gotta
anyway.
learn it. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
even for a little while, and then they are. I'm so sorry. Okay, now you can come out, right?
Yeah,
Is that the idea? Yeah,
yeah.
because
That's the idea.
I agree that I don't see it that way. I think of it more like pain as sort of beckoning to go into a different path. So it's not that God is himself taking people and throwing them into the flames. I like C.S. Lewis's separationist model, where there are things that we can do that separate us from certain aspects of goodness, and even those separations, I think, can forge experiences that can reap value. I do believe in that, but that there's a kind of a pain in the separation that's natural and inevitable, and then plays a role of beckoning you into places that are more helpful for you. And so I don't really think about it as like the punitive theory, but more in terms of the separationist model.
I,
Um,
I
and it serves this purpose.
so I don't see so God like the sovereignty whole thing, right? Like the you chose to lock yourself in the burning building, right? Like that does not seem to like no. I wouldn't let my kid do that, right? Like you go back to this sort of a thing of like like it doesn't matter if like oh well you kind of separated yourself and walked into the burning building, or God threw you in the burning building, right? There's no burning building that's compatible. There's you cannot get into like if there's the flames, if there's a God, there's no flames, right? You don't go through that, right? Like that sort of a thing. It doesn't matter if it was separationalist or if I even locked myself in the door. If inmates were running the asylum, right, and they were like just they locked the doors and they were torturing each other, and the
Mhm.
warden saw this and didn't stop it, right? The warden would get arrested. Right? Like that violates the idea of goodness, I think.
I definitely agree with that. Like, I definitely agree that there are scenarios that we can come up with that can include certain elements of what I'm describing, and those scenarios aren't good for various reasons. And so I think kind of maybe the open challenge, like kind of for everybody as they're thinking about this, is there a scenario in which the goods are forged, and they're the kinds of scenarios that it would make a lot of sense for beings to come into? And maybe this is the time to sort of come back to the value of playing those RTS games, right? Because this is sort of like a little microcosm of an idea where It doesn't explain everything, but it illustrates something for me anyway. And what it illustrates for me is that we do permit each other to come into states that have uncertainty. And I was telling some friends that to win a game, like an RTS game, I'm willing to go through pain. I'm willing to press that button so hard that it's like, it's hurting. Okay. I'm willing to do that. The risk of it because I want to achieve something great. Now, a game is kind of a silly example because it's a
Sure.
game, right? But if you think about increasing the stakes where you're achieving the creation of a beautiful arena and you're invited to be part of this project of building out this beautiful arena in a context that's not originally good, but we're learning the lessons of love. We're learning how to rule together. We're learning how to cooperate and build out these things. Would it be worth the risk of certain terrible pains if all those pains could then be used for something good? It's not that God is allowing you to have that pain to punish you or even to just say, hey, you know what, you chose to be in that pain. It's not that you're choosing to be in the pain. It's that you're choosing that. This is the thing that I feel like gets lost in some of these discussions, is that you can choose to come into a state that's risky in order to experience certain kinds of qualities of triumph and victory, and they depend on the risk of necessity. And so you're not choosing the suffering. And then does God have to stop you from doing that? Or can he allow you to do that, especially if he knows that the end result is going to be good? I'm really curious what you might think about this.
So I guess the thing of that I would go is like, yeah, so like I'll take certain risks. Like I've had certain jobs where I've had to go and I've been on, potentially dangerous areas and I've got all the safety equipment, whatever, but I've had
Mhm.
to go into like heavy construction areas and deal with certain problems. But the idea was like, well, if everything failed and like I fell down and I went into this horrific and had this horrific accident, I would go through
Yeah.
the pain because I took this risk. But God is God. And if the pain was going to happen, God could just stop the pain and be like, "Up, here you
That
go, pick you back up, off, and let's go." Right? There's no reason for it to happen, and I guess this goes back into like like ultimately that logic takes you back to why aren't we just in a heaven world, right?
is it, I was just reading a book by a neuroscientist talking about certain people who wouldn't experience like a sense of danger. And then those people would end up like getting into danger a lot more often.
Yes,
They wouldn't experience, and then there's these other examples where people don't experience pain.
yes,
And I remember seeing a case where they would actually have a machine that would like give them pain if they're doing something that's harming their body, so that they would stop harming their body. But then they
yes,
like take off their machine if they can, but then they end
yeah,
up harming their body.
body.
And so I think about that because I think, well, maybe negative states play roles that couldn't be played in other more effective ways. Like it's necessarily the case that pain can call you back from something in a way that mere positive incentives don't always work.
I don't. I guess I just don't see, especially when you get into the idea of heaven, of just you're in this relation and there's no pain. There's so fundamental the concept of heaven is there's no pain, there's no sin, there's no suffering, right? And you're just this eternal bliss and communion with God, and it's
Hmm.
just well, you you could just be in that state and have all the knowledge. You have an eternity to gain the knowledge. Let's pretend you even had to earn it, but you could have been created with all the knowledge. There's
All the
nothing
knowledge.
yes, I think any of the knowledge that you would gain through any experience, there's no logical contradiction. There's no necessitating thing without assuming a principle that you must necessitate to get the knowledge, right? That God could not just create somebody in that state. And I
So
think
here's the principle. Knowledge is built on experience.
uh,
I think that's the necessary principle. I don't think you could have all the knowledge that's
so.
possible in the future because it comes through experience.
This sort of brings me to a topic you've said something along these lines that made me want to blurt this out. But God being omniscient, right? Necessarily being God being a necessary being, and
Yeah.
and being omniscient and omnipotent. Like God can't learn things, right? Like you had talked about like God getting new experiences by like going through us in like a future
Yeah.
tense or something like that. And it's like God can't do that by
Well, so I
definition.
think
Like
that, so in my view, and for the reasons you're articulating, sort of on one side of the ship, I'm saying, hey, those are treasures, and they actually help me to think about. what fundamental reality would be like, but then also have an independent reason, just in epistemology. It seems to me that knowledge is built on experience. And then I have views on the nature of time that lead me ultimately to think that that it's not possible for all knowledge to be actual. In fact, I think this leads to, let me be more careful. All knowledge that could be potentially built up is not already there in reality, because this is going to lead to paradoxes of self-reference. So I actually have some work on this. And so in my view, my working model of reality, and I think it builds on some of your considerations, which I think are really good considerations, is that God would have the knowledge of what's real and what's
Mm-hmm.
present, but that God absolutely does learn. He grows in his awareness of things through the advancement of reality.
You're killing me, Smalls. I swear, because one of the things I'm working on was the idea of a paradox of omniscience, and so the idea that God is supposed to be unchanging, and the
Yeah,
idea of like, well, like if God has libertarian free will, then God would have to know that He chose to create, and you were like, well, God knows all possible futures, so therefore He knows all truths before He decides to do it. But then God gets the knowledge of what is actual. So then, if
yeah,
God knows, then if God knows what is the consequences of his libertarian free choices, then he can't be omniscient. But then, if he doesn't know it, then he grows, so he can't be
yeah,
unchanging,
yeah.
right? And so this is one of those omniscience paradoxes
Yeah, I
that
love
comes
it.
out of
See, this is what's happening, John. You're on one side of the boat as the counter
it.
apologist, and I'm on the other side of the boat building up this worldview. And we're like kind of working together, because I'm like, I'll take that. Yeah, God is changing, at least extrinsically, in terms of his knowledge of reality, because reality is changing. Follow the evidence where it leads, right? It's still a fundamental stuff of existence. It still has intelligence in order to explain various features of reality, which we won't go into because that would be
Yeah, it sounds.
too long of a
Yeah.
conversation. But we can go ahead and shave off some of the theologies that you have independent reasons to doubt. And hey, I'll follow you there.
I get so this
No,
is why I love you. So it's loving and maddening at the same time. But then I go back to these things where it's just like the I believe in one less God than you, like the Ricky Gervais atheism, right? You know,
I believe in one less mind independent stuff than you.
right. So but then you go,
So
but
we're
then
equal.
the apologetic answer to that is just like you're just being nonsense because God is God and God is the triomni necessary being and right.
That's not my.
I,
I
I
don't give that
and
attitude.
and you
Yeah,
go, yeah, not saying that's you, but I
yeah, yeah,
you are very special diamond. There's not many of you. So I get a lot of that stuff. And it's just like, well, that's not like, and I say, well, that's no, that can't exist, right? That's where
hmm
my atheism is where
yeah.
I say,
I
like, I
appreciate that
know there is no God. That's
of
what I
that
mean.
sort.
So, but if you go
Okay.
like, oh, there's a deistic God, well, then I'm going to be an
Ah,
agnostic, right? So,
yeah,
like I'm an agnostic towards a deistic God, but that a
yeah.
deistic God is not God as you talk
In
about
that sense.
in the philosophy of religion. When you talk to these
Okay.
theists who try to say, like a Thomistic thing of like this is what God must be, and
hmm
those sorts of things. And so, yes, I reject that very stringent definition of what God is. And here
hmm
you are saying, well, no, of course, God has to learn. And it's just like, that's not the God of monotheism, or at least that's for my like. This is why
Yeah.
you're blowing my paradigm here.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is kind of how we make progress together. This is like one of my themes is like, I want everybody working together. And we can only do that if we see each other, value each other, listen to each other, be willing to be wrong. Somebody's going to send in an email about how there's a near death experience that contradicts what I was proposing. And that's great. That's going to upgrade me, right?
Yes.
That's great. And I do think that kind of the way that I think about fundamental reality is that I have maybe some core concepts that maybe I have a little more confidence in, and then I have some sort of connected concepts that are working hypotheses. And so then I have conversations like this, and I'm sort of testing those working hypotheses, and I'm building out my view. And I can put this in neutral terms between the atheist and the theist. It's like, look, we're in a reality together. Okay.
Yes.
Somehow the stuff of existence, whatever it is, gave rise to beings like us who can wonder how we got here. Right.
Sure.
And so, now we have some things in common. There's a stuff of existence. We arose. And then I'm filling in with more than that. So I think it's got an intelligence. And I want to shave off arbitrary fundamental limits. People who know my work, I think it has a fundamental goodness. to it. But that leaves a lot open right there in terms of, hey, could this thing grow in its knowledge through experience? I've come to think so. I didn't always think this. I used to be kind of a Platonist who thought it was all just there. It's funny because my wife, Rachel, before we were married, she was kind of skeptical of my Platonism. And it's funny because it seems like all the things that she was skeptical of, I didn't agree with her. But then by my own path, I was like, oh, okay, I guess you're probably right about that.
Husband
It's kind of an
comes to agree with wife. Film at
yeah,
11. No.
it happens.
No, that's, oof. I guess there's definitely, you go when I go to you go to like that level. I go, well, yeah, I'm definitely more agnostic. Although and this is definitely a conversation for another time. But it's just like, well, then how do you even connect that to like the gospel of Christianity and Jesus Christ being the Son of God and the resurrection and the atonement
Narrative
and
structure of reality
the
that's
what?
bigger than a religion. Narrative structure of reality that's bigger than a religion, but shows up in high points within religions. I think Jesus represents God, and he does that in a way that opens a gate of salvation, and that's the Christian way of putting that. But we could put that in other terms. Wholeness, that Greek word sozo means wholeness. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That sounds like that exclusivist Christian until you understand if truth means reality, I am the reality, and you come into connection with God and wholeness by your alignment with reality. Because I sort of see you through your story coming into alignment with aspects of reality that have made you more whole,
I
made you more powerful.
I have to say, all of this works because you're a universalist. That's astounding.
I want to
Like,
draw you into a relationship with the deistic God, John. Start with that. Take the road of Antony Flew. Come to the deistic God. Come to the altar of the deistic God.
yeah, I'll
That
go.
will get more specific after that.
I'll go have a whiskey and worship. It's fine because I have no idea what to do with that, right? So, um, I could certainly see um, like in that sort of a thing, where it's like the demarcation line, and that gets like I just hear from someone whose family converted from Catholicism to evangelical Christian,
Mhm.
Protestantism, and then like the works versus faith thing, and you say that dividing line, and it's just like, well, at least on that view,
Mhm.
on the view you espouse, I could see a thing of like, man, maybe I should go do more charity work, right? Like maybe instead of like giving money to a charity, I ought to be like trying to volunteer and go do it. Like right now it's
Mhm.
like, I don't have the time. It's a lot easier to be like, here's your money. I'll give to your cause, but I can't afford to go do it. It's like, well, at least there's like a motivating factor on a
There you go.
works-based system and like on your thing, right? Like at least there's that, and you can almost Pascalian wager, and it's just like, well, if what he's saying is right, I'm helping myself out in the end, and I got a motivation to do it. And if he's wrong, well, at least I just did something good,
Mhm.
Or the hedonist would say that you've squandered an opportunity for true enjoyment, but that's a whole
Well, it's
different thing.
connected. I mean, Plato, he talks about the enjoyment of the wholeness. It feels good to be internally integrous, if that makes sense. Like it feels good to be like honest and charitable when it comes from those internal desires. If it's purely external, then you can
That's a
sort of fake it
that's a
till you make
problem.
it. But then it's almost like you're actually using others as a means.
Hmm.
And that doesn't feel good. That's sort of the other side of the evangelism that I've experienced, where somebody's using me as a means to evangelize. Um, and I've sort of been on both sides of that. And I kind of learned that no, actually, I think people are intrinsically valuable. It's part of my view of people. So I don't want to treat them as a means for my charity work. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No,
Or for my evangelism or whatever it is, right?
that was a key part of my deconversion, was just
Yeah.
like the idea of like the reprobate was a necessary cost in order to have the elect in heaven. And it was like we're
Hmm.
using them as a means to an end, and that's just
Yeah.
fundamentally wrong, right? So like that
See,
entire theodicy just
see,
doesn't work. Yeah.
you move closer to the good. You move closer.
Oh man, look at you! You've convinced an atheist he's saved. It's wonderful. All right. I think that's probably a good place to end it. If you are, I think I very much enjoyed it. Maybe we'll do
Yeah.
this again sometime. Um,
Yeah. I think just kind of my final remarks. Yeah, just thank you.
please.
This has just been a lot of fun for me. This is great. This is my favorite kind of conversation. And maybe kind of for the audience, we talked a lot about we brought up so many different topics. We opened up many, many doors,
Yeah.
going down many, many corridors. And I just kind of want to say that everything that we talked about leads into a nest of complexity. When we're talking about the eternal conscious torment views and the annihilation views, and atheism of various sorts and universalism of various sorts, like I maybe do want to kind of land on this point that reasonable people can disagree, but then also there's so much value in that disagreement, because I feel like even in this conversation, we're able to just bring out a lot of issues together and maybe paint a bigger picture together instead of seeing each other as sort of like enemies trying to compete for our picture. Maybe we could take all the pictures and all the different places of security, bring them all out into the meadow of reality and try to paint something bigger together. This just gets me excited because I think we can learn more from each other. So those are
Certainly.
my final thoughts.
Well, I definitely have learned quite a lot just from interacting with you and consuming your work alone, and certainly tonight. So thank you very
Thank
much for
you.
coming on. Maybe we'll do it again sometime. But again, it was very,
Sounds good.
very good time, sir.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you. Take care, everyone.